Greetings, dear listeners. Today we will delve deeper into the relation between storytelling, religion, and the contemporary revival of idealism. And once again, I'm joined by the perfect guest to discuss these topics.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kevin Keating, and I am a author and professor of English, and I've been teaching fiction writing classes for many years now. Before that, though, I was a working class guy and worked in the steel mills in Cleveland, Ohio. But doing that kind of labor is a little hard on your back, and I thought writing would be a much easier profession. But as it turns out, writing has more challenges in some ways than working in the steel mills. But here I am to have this wonderful conversation today with you, Jonas. Thank you for inviting me on. It's a real honor to be here.
Well, Kevin, it's great to have you here. The initial motivation for inviting you on the show was the recent publication of your new book, Bridge of Dreams. And it's a book which brings together 3 interrelated short stories with a magical realism bent. And I like them a lot, I must say. I particularly love the way you initially place your characters in a seemingly mundane setting, and then gradually they experience a whole journey through wonder and mystery. And so anyone who picks up your book is certainly guaranteed a dreamy experience, if you ask me. However, as you know, in my podcast conversations, I normally don't discuss fiction. But in your book, themes like religion, reincarnation, psychedelics, spiritual transformation, and so on are constantly present in the background somewhere. And so, considering you're an author and considering you're a professor of English and you teach literature, I thought this could provide a great opportunity to approach religion and contemporary spirituality from the perspective of storytelling. So let me dive in with a rather straightforward question to the topic. Do you think that humans are inherently story-creating creatures? And if so, might religion be some kind of inevitable result of this basic, fundamental storytelling impulse?
First, I'd like to thank you for that question because I never thought about that so deeply, but your choice of wording there made me think a little bit more deeply about this. So within your question, there's an assumption. Are we story creating creatures? Do we actively create the stories? Or do we passively receive them through the unconscious mind? So how much of it is ego, that limited part of our consciousness that thinks it's in control of everything when in fact it's in control of very little? And how much is coming from outside of ourselves in the form of, say, inspiration or intuition? And so the deeper I thought about this, I thought maybe there are 3 different ways in which human beings engage in storytelling, maybe not necessarily story creating, but storytelling. So the first one is storytelling as habit. And I suppose maybe a little bit later we'll talk about Rupert Sheldrake and his idea of morphic genetic fields, morphic resonance. But I think it might have something to do with that, where storytelling is more like a habit. There's a guy, I'd like to get his name for everyone. He wrote a book. It's called The Literary Mind. The author's name is Mark Turner. And he did this really exhaustive study of this and found that storytelling is almost like the stream of consciousness, a constant flow of our thoughts. We're always thinking about stories in the future, what-if scenarios, hypotheticals. So it's Christmas time, and it's like, what should I buy my wife for Christmas? Which thing would she enjoy more? Should I buy this gift or should I buy that gift? Should I take a particular job or not? What's the future going to look like if I do take a certain position? Or if I turn that job down and take another job? We're projecting into the future a kind of narrative, and Turner says that's kind of habit. It's thinking before acting. We love to play out those sorts of scenarios. That doesn't take much creativity for most people. We all engage in that kind of thinking. But I'm not exactly sure that it's inspired creativity. There's a guy who wrote a book called Rational Mysticism. The author's name is John Horgan. And he said it almost becomes like automated. So you could think of it this way. You don't have to think much about tying your shoe. For most people, at least in America, you don't have to think much about driving a car. After a while, the repetitive action of tying your shoe or driving a car becomes automatic. It's the same thing with storytelling. We're constantly telling ourselves stories in our heads. Not the most creative stuff in the world, but we do play out scenarios like that. So I like to say that most narrative is probably fully automated. And what you want to do as a creative writer is get rid of that automatization. So how do you put yourself into the correct frame of mind where you're getting inspiration from outside of yourself, so to speak? It's a difficult thing to achieve sometimes. Second type of storytelling is intuition or inspiration. I'm kind of using those words interchangeably, but it's almost like an independent psychic force that's working outside of you. How do you tap into that sort of thing? I like to compare that almost to dreaming. We don't get to decide what our dreams are typically. I've heard people arguing that lucid dreaming is possible. I've never experienced that myself. I suppose it's possible. But it's like you cannot summon a dream through sheer willpower. Tonight, for instance, I can't mark down in my calendar, I'm going to schedule this dream for tonight, and then next week I think I'm going to have this other sort of dream. They just happen spontaneously on their own. What is that phenomenon precisely? It's very mysterious. And I think the best creative stories are like that. It's a psychic force coming from outside of you, so to speak, and then you try to jot it down on paper. But then that leads me to the third part of the element. Now, this gets to Joseph Campbell's idea that the famous mythologist who wrote Hero with a Thousand Faces, and he said writing can be a form of yoga, that is a meditative practice, where you're attempting to control your mind. You're trying to shut down that constant flow of ideas and concentrate maybe on just one thing. Just a little aside, I remember Alan Watson asked Joseph Campbell, "What is your yoga?" And he said, underlining books. That's sort of been my yoga too for many years.
It's a beautiful reply.
I think so. Part of being a writer too is, all right, so you're inspired by something that seems to be from outside of you. It could be an image or an intuitive feeling of some kind. But at some point, you've got to sit down with a blank piece of paper and put the words on the page, and you have to concentrate on what am I saying in this sentence, in the next sentence, line by line, word by word. That's the sort of meditative practice of writing. So most writing is habit. You're hoping for some sort of inspiration that's a psychic force outside of yourself. But at some point, you do have to do the hard work of focusing your mind and getting the words on the paper so other people can enjoy the vision that you've had. So that's how I see the storytelling process. Three distinct parts.
The second half of my question was, of course, all those three, I can definitely relate to them. I see how there are three different ways of the same thing creating stories. Some of them habitual, some of them inspired, as you say, but that even the word inspired itself immediately brings us to religion. And so I guess that those three facets are also very present in all religious traditions, where you've got the habit, and I mean the ritual. You constantly do the thing. And if I say religion can be seen as, I mostly say languages, but I could just as well use the word stories. But not stories simply in telling them or in writing them, but stories and languages which use symbols, which use rituals, which use all sorts of elements, practices as well, not just words or ideas, but embodied practices as well, to constantly retell similar stories, a certain memory which is transferred from one generation to the other, and that memory allows people to place things in their proper place, to give meaning to the world, to give meaning in the sense of making sure this is important and this is the most important and that thing is less important. But why is that so? It's not just a fact. If you just look at the world in a bunch of facts, then everything has the same value. But religion seems to be half of the time the thing which gives the hierarchy to whatever is valuable in the world. And you cannot do that in any other way unless through story. It's story which gives importance to your own life. And so in that sense, I was wondering whether you also could see religion as this story-creating mechanism.
I suppose you'd have to define what is the religious impulse. And the best thing that I can think of is the religious impulse. It's the intuitive feeling. So that is, it's experiential, but it is a feeling that despite all evidence to the contrary, life is fundamentally good and meaningful. But how do you translate that intuitive feeling onto the page? At some point, I know I was jotting down these notes, but I thought in the evolution of that religious impulse, would it not be more practical to express that emotion, if we're dealing strictly with emotion first, primarily emotion, through singing, dancing, chanting, in other words, ritual, and possibly, I just saw this in something from Alan Watts, where he thought maybe it was primarily image-based. And so we get to storytelling. Might storytelling come a little bit later in the process because there are so many moving parts? But if you have a sudden feeling, emotional feeling, the first way that you might want to express it is through singing or dancing or chanting rather than storytelling. So in the evolution of the religious impulse, perhaps storytelling came later. I don't know. It's just a hypothesis that I'm putting forward. But to get to your point, I think storytelling does have a practical application because that emotional feeling cannot last for long periods of time, I don't think. And so you want to memorialize it in some way. Storytelling might be a way to say, all right, I've had this experience. If I put it in storytelling form, it imprints on my memory a little bit further, and I can express the idea to other people a little bit more effectively than I could otherwise.
Yeah, and it's also a way of taking people along with your emotion and your experience and so on, and kind of driving them in this similar path, or at least try to drive them in a similar path. And I get your point. There's a primordial experience probably, which is then expressed in words, and whether religion is the experience itself or the story that makes sense of the experience. Let's not get bogged down into that discussion. We could talk about it, but that's not the thing I'm trying to get at. I'm more trying to get at, in any case, there are a bunch of experiences, spiritual, religious, call them what you want, and it's the stories around them that try to confer them to other people and which takes people along within the same experience and tries to bring them to the point where they perhaps might also have similar experiences and so on. And the thing that I find interesting to think about is whether we are incapable of not being religious in that sense. And so people would say that we have a secular society, but if this story creation is what religion is, and this emotional and spiritual experience of being simply is the first thing that we have, and that whatever we experience about being, we try to put into words, but the words are never factual words. It's only story and symbol which allows us to properly confer those really deep experiences. And those stories and symbols will never be factually true or false. That's not even what they're about, but they try to convey in a certain way these deeper emotions. And so my idea would be that the secular world is just as full of those kinds of stories and symbols. It claims to be rational and neutral or something like that and factual. But in the end, if you really look at what's going on, there's just as much story creation going on and symbol creation going on to also express certain underlying experiences.
The one example that I was thinking of when you sent some of the questions was in Genesis 2. Well, first I would say that the story, I think, typically defined for most people, you're going to have a character performing an action in a kind of setting. And so the first thing that came to my mind, I've been looking at Robert Alter has been translating the Hebrew Bible, did the entire thing by himself. He's a professor from I think he's at Berkeley, if I'm not mistaken, but just an incredible achievement. And just looking at his translation of Genesis, but this sort of struck me. You have a god, anthropomorphized character, let's say, performing an action, planting a garden. And why would a garden specifically as setting be religious in any sense? It's like, well, if you think about a garden, it's been separated in some way from the wilderness. It's being manipulated. When you're in a garden, you expect to see some artful arrangement of flowers and trees and plants and so forth. And then I was thinking, now, even in a secular world where we're trying to denigrate every kind of religious impulse, why would flowers still hold deep meaning for people? And if you think of specifically, say, a wedding or a funeral, and these rituals are being conducted by people, let's say, who are completely, they have no religion, no interest in religion at all. Why would they use flowers during these rituals? What is so deeply meaningful about something like that? It's very mysterious. It's like there's a sort of religious impulse there, I think. The secular world might try to deny that, but there it is. And I never thought about this before, but my daughter, we named my daughter Rose. It's like, why would we name children after flowers? Something deeply meaningful is going on there. So we're trying to get rid of this, I think, through our secular life. But nevertheless, these images keep popping up. And it's almost as though we intuitively understand that there is something sacred about nature and that the flower is a representation of something much grander than ourselves, what Rupert Sheldrake calls the more than human world. This is almost working at the level of instinct. No one has to explain to you why a flower is beautiful. You just look at it and you know that it is beautiful. Although I've noticed this. So I was raised Catholic, and I sort of rebelled against Catholicism. And I was thinking deeply about this over the last few years. It's like, why did I rebel so much against Catholicism? I was brought up in a post-Vatican II Catholic Church where the architecture became almost corporate, We didn't have the big, beautiful kinds of cathedrals that you have in Europe with these gorgeous stained glass windows. The Latin Mass was gone. All of the beauty seemed to have been extracted from the ritual. There was nothing aesthetically pleasing about my childhood religious upbringing. I think people yearn for that. Somehow the transcendent is expressed through that beauty. Well, so we try to bring that into storytelling. So there's God, and God is doing planting, and he's planting a garden. There's flowers there. Why is that religious? And yet there it is, right away, practically page 1 of this massive book. We're using images to convey the religious impulse.
Absolutely. Flowers are indeed a very poignant example of how in a secular world people do sense the sacredness of beauty, let's say, within the flower. You just see it and you know it's there from a platonic point of view. That would be the most obvious thing in the world, that there's the archetype of beauty, and which is ingrained within your soul, and that's what you recognize when you see the flower. But it becomes difficult in a materialist secular world where matter is the only thing that there is, and that beauty is something that you completely invented in your head. That makes it a bit bizarre. So that's certainly a part where those religious impulses constantly pop up within the secular world. But for me, another aspect of this storytelling is that within religion, or within religious traditions, let me phrase them as traditions, within the traditions that people continue to live in and that kind of surround them, even when they're not actively thinking about it, within the symbols that they see around them, within the stories that are being told everywhere, from your mother at your bed at night when you go to sleep to whatever stories are told in high school. Traditions and cultures have always ingrained people within a whole matrix of stories, which only makes sense within that matrix, whether that matrix refers to the life of Christ or whether that matrix refers to the Quran and the life of the Prophet. Doesn't really matter. There's this matrix of stories that people live in, and that kind of structures society in an organic way, not in a top-down corporate way, but in a more organic way. It gives you the tools to speak about loads of things. And that's also a facet that I think that the secular world has. It claims to be factual, but it is a matrix of stories which deems certain things more important than other things. And so here's my question for you. What do you think are those structuring stories, or some of the most important stories of the secular world, which you perhaps could even call the religious stories, which we are blind to, that they're as dogmatic as, let's say, Trinity has been in the Christian tradition?
It's interesting that you mentioned like an archetype or a Platonic form. Mm-hmm. And I'm fascinated by that concept. Why are we attracted to... See, I think the key word here is like attraction. This is why I like Rupert Sheldrake's idea of morphogenetic fields, that maybe science and the secular world is almost pathologically focused purely, as you said, on information, facts. And, human beings are just machines that can be programmed. But I think probably a better way to think of it, as you were saying, is that it's more like an organism. We are organisms, certainly, and maybe the religious impulse also is a kind of organism. But, how do even organisms come into being exactly? I like Sheldrake's metaphor that you can think of like a magnet, and metal shavings are attracted to that magnet. It's kind of mysterious. I mean, we can describe an electromagnetic field, but do we know exactly what that is? And maybe it's the same thing with storytelling, that we're just attracted to particular types of story. And that's very mysterious. There's this guy, his name's Christopher Booker, and I highly recommend this to everyone. He wrote a massive volume. It's called The 7 Basic Plots. And he said, why is it that we are attracted to those 7 plots? Most people will almost reward storytelling, like authors and filmmakers, if they adhere to these 7 basic plots. One of which might be something like overcoming the monster is a very basic one. Maybe you've seen Jaws by Steven Spielberg. And, that's a film from 1975 or 76 or something, and it's still massively popular. There's something that attracts people to that particular story, and it's one that's told over and over again. Beowulf might be another good example. It's like slaying the dragon. My favorite is a voyage and return story, where you leave home, you go out into the world, experience lots and lots of different adventures, and then you come back. Except you can never come back as the same person. As a result of all of the adventures that you've undergone, you're changed as an individual. And typically what the character experiences during the adventure is obstacle after obstacle. And with great storytelling, obviously, the obstacles have to get more and more severe. You're trying to create a sense of tension, and you're ratcheting up that tension more and more and more until this breaking point finally happens. You know, you could see this, I think, a little bit in religion, too, say with the story of Christ. So an incarnation of God. So he's here on earth and experiencing all of these adventures. And it's obstacle after obstacle, and things are getting worse and worse until the inevitable finally happens, you know. And then there's that resurrection. Things change as a consequence of this. The rebirth motif. This is another thing that people are attracted to.
Which is, of course, also in the story of Christ.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
And what, according to you, is the explanation? Why would we be attracted to 7, you said? 7 particular stories or variations thereof?
Yeah, Booker lists 7, and sometimes those 7 can be mixed together a little bit. But again, it's one of those mysterious things. It's like, why are those metal shavings attracted to the magnet? Why are human beings attracted to those 7? Well, all right, so one would be tragedy, and tragedy usually consists of someone who's become arrogant, it's filled with hubris, and as a result of that arrogance is met sooner or later with catastrophe. Maybe one reason that we're attracted to a story like that is because it's part of our experience. We see that happening over and over and over again. It's sort of factual, I suppose you might say, but it's typical of the human experience. The voyage and return story, the quest, is a very typical story that you'll often encounter.
Yeah. Which, of course, brings us to Joseph Campbell's ideas as well. He didn't see necessarily 7 different stories, but one huge monomyth, which also has a lot to do with the voyage and the rebirth even, and so on.
Yeah, so that's a good one that I often use for my students. And I know some people are a bit critical of Campbell, but if you think about the monomyth this way, you're going along with your typical day, and then a crisis occurs, something terrible happens. How do you deal with the crisis? I think that's what most stories are about. We don't want to see characters who are just having a good day every single day, page after page. Sooner or later, we want to see the crisis. And I think the reason for that is you only find out who a person truly is when the crisis happens. How are you going to handle this particular situation? There's a film that I sometimes show my students, a clip. It's very brief. It's only about 3 minutes. Anyone can YouTube this. It's called Force Majeure. I don't know if you've ever seen this film, but there's a couple on vacation, and they've done well for themselves. They're at a ski resort, and they have their 2 small children with them. And while they're at the ski resort, they're enjoying a beautiful lunch outside on the terrace. And a controlled avalanche is set off at the resort. Here comes the snow, and it's heading directly toward that restaurant where the couple is sitting enjoying lunch. Well, the father gets so frightened that he leaps up out of his seat and runs away and abandons his wife and 2 small children to the avalanche. Meanwhile, the wife gathers up her 2 children and hugs them closely. She's prepared to go down with the ship, so to speak, you know. Here's the terrible crisis. We find out what the husband is like, and we find out what the mother in that scenario is like. And it's a revelation of character. Now, all right, apply this to the religion. Here comes the big crisis. Jesus is betrayed by someone. You know, that's a revelation of character for the person who's done the betrayal. And Peter, right, denies knowing him 3 times. It's a revelation of character. Meanwhile, Jesus is prepared to go through the whole thing. I mean, he asks for a reprieve from his father, but willingly. I've heard this as a definition too. All right, so the crisis happens, and the heroic character is the person who willingly puts himself or herself through the suffering, typically for a higher goal or for other people. So in force majeure, the mother in that scenario, she is willing to suffer for her children. If she knows she can protect the lives of those two small kids, she's going to do it. Meanwhile, the dad runs off, which is a typical impulse. I think most of us instinctively would run away from danger. But there are times when you can control your fear and face the danger head on. I kind of learned that about myself just recently. I was on a vacation on a little island off the coast of Honduras called Roatan. And I was face to face with a reef shark. It was swimming very close to me. It took a lot of willpower to control the fear, but you can do it. Now, that wasn't in the service of some higher good. It was mainly self-preservation.
But still.
It was a little frightening. But you can imagine if you take both of those cases, force majeure and the story of Christ, literally just the absolute fear that you must confront, but willing to face that fear. And I think that's what Campbell is really getting at. It's the abyss is what you're looking for.
But one thing that I find fascinating, or let's say it's a hypothesis that I've been living with and I really wanted to ask you about, is that when you talk about various stories that we're attracted to as human beings, and then Campbell with his monomyth explaining how different mythologies have a similar pattern because they are always explaining those very human emotions and experiences that we all know and that we are, again, somehow attracted to. I have the feeling that in the Western secular world, let's say, we actually don't have several stories anymore that we're attracted to, but we kind of got stuck in one particular story, which is kind of the monomyth. But I'm not sure, because I'm not a scholar of Joseph Campbell or something. I haven't read much of his books. So I want you to enlighten me, not only whether I'm correct in thinking whether society has gotten stuck in one story, but whether Joseph Campbell perhaps meant it in a different way. Because what I see is nothing but the myth of the hero. You've got somebody who's a bit of the outcast. He goes through an adventure, encounters somebody who tells him you have to believe in yourself. Then he starts believing in himself, overcomes his fear, and then shines because he either slayed the monster or even almost died or completely died and resurrected, and then gives back some present to the rest of the world. Yes, that's part of the monomyth. And you see it everywhere. I mean, it's Rambo, it's the Disney, every Disney story is this same story, and it's also in Star Wars and so on, and it's also the type of storytelling that is being taught in scenario schools or in literature, that this is the way you make an exciting story. And it's almost as if we only know this story. If you, for example, if you compare or contrast Disney movies with the anime movies from Japan, from Miyazaki and so on, then you'll see that in the Miyazaki movies, you've got this very Buddhist idea of doing your duty. There is no conquering. There's just, I do what I have to do because I have to do it. And often those stories for us in the West, they'll seem like they don't have the right arch in the story because they go back and forward, because the line is whether you do your duty, not whether you conquer your fears necessarily. And also, if I think about the old myths, let's say Icarus or something like that. Icarus is probably the best example. It starts as a myth of the hero. he and his dad are stuck in the labyrinth, and then they try to get out because there's this monster, the Minotaur, and the dad is a scientist and he knows what to do, and so they paste feathers on their arms and they fly out. And the dad says, "Watch out! Don't go too far, because if you get too close to the sun, you'll burn your feathers and the wax will melt and you'll fall into the sea." And the son is a bit young and hubristic, and so he's very happy to get out of the labyrinth, goes too close to the sun and dies. And so that's also a part. Most of our myths of the hero, whether in popular literature or movies or wherever, they tend to stop at the hero conquered everything. But in the old myths, there used to be this fall, there used to be this idea of hubris, there used to be still death somewhere around the corner, not just life. And if you look at society, we have this society which only thinks in terms of growing and getting bigger and getting even more money and showing off how great you are because you conquered all those, I don't know what kind of adventures that you encountered in your life. It has become also the story that you tell of yourself, and it seems like it's the only story you can tell yourself. We're all very busy all the time, because being busy shows that you're kind of conquering something. But in another mythological context, you could be just as happy with seeing the flower and experiencing the beauty and acknowledging that as the start and end point of all good life, just being there with the beauty. And so here I am. Either am I correct in seeing this as like the monomyth of society, and has Joseph Campbell somehow been distorted? Did he have much more to say? And did people only derive this particular aspect of his monomyth and not see the other aspects of it?
I really was struck by how you were talking about a story, told through a Buddhist lens, and how it's a little bit different than Joseph Campbell's idea. I was just watching this analysis of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and so the theory goes that Tolkien didn't believe in a hero, that there are no heroes in life. There are only people who perform heroic deeds from time to time to the best of their ability. And sin, I think, can be defined as going against the Tao, if you will, or the natural order of things, or God's will. So for Tolkien, it's something like there's a heroic adventure. It's like you're trying to fulfill God's will, but no human being is capable of doing that. We're just too flawed. We're incapable. But you try to do the best you can. And I guess I have not finished the entire series. I just started reading it, as a matter of fact, Fellowship of the Ring, the first part of that. But it's such an old story. Everyone knows how it goes. But Frodo gets almost to the end of the adventure and then can't quite fulfill it by throwing the ring into the fire pit, right? He's gone as far as he can with that particular hero deed. But to describe anyone as heroic it's foolhardy. So, maybe you're right about that. Maybe we've become too obsessed, at least in commercial kinds of enterprises. Still, in serious literature, you do see someone who's not exactly matching the more commercialized version of Campbell's output. It's a little less Star Wars-like. I'm reminded of, say, great authors like William Faulkner or Herman Melville, and even James Joyce, which I think becomes more of an intellectual exercise than an emotional and an experiential one. But there, with Ulysses, you're dealing with Leopold Bloom, presumably the protagonist of the book, but, deeply flawed individual. And I still love the Greek tragedies and things, and Shakespeare, of course. I think there was an author, a British author named Will Self, and he said, the tragedy really with great storytelling literature like that is it's become a cultic enterprise. It's a little bit like classical music, You're always going to have an audience for classical music. You'll always have an audience for serious literature and storytelling, but it's going to be a small group of people, relatively speaking. And that most people are probably going to flock to the theaters to see the latest Marvel movie or Superman movie or what have you. And that's, that commercialized version of the Joseph Campbell's hero myth. So you're probably correct in saying that. But I wonder if people deeply crave different types of stories with the flawed character. That can't go away. I mean, it would go against human nature and just nature in general, I think, to delude ourselves into thinking that people are constantly heroic all the time. It's a little bit narcissistic, isn't it? Mm-hmm. It's feeding into the ego, and the ego is always thinking it's in control of everything and needs validation constantly.
And so there's my question. What did Joseph Campbell say about it? Did he see that himself, that the hero motif could become this egotistic thing? Because in a sense, Campbell has this spiritual view of life where you should overcome the darknesses of your ego to become a more full human being, let's say. And did he acknowledge the possibility of this hero motif itself becoming egoic?
It's funny. I was just looking before this podcast at The Hero with a Thousand Faces again, and he actually says that hero motif is actually a disguise for the true hero is the person who can vanquish the ego, who can destroy the ego. But then he says you run into a problem. It's a real paradox. How can the ego destroy itself, which is what you're asking for? At some point, Campbell says you come to an umbilical point, a kind of singularity. How can the ego destroy the ego? This is the hero's adventure. So he is acknowledging the fact that you've got to get rid of the ego. After all, the person who willfully suffers for other people is completely willing to have their ego destroyed. Like literally, they're willing to die for others. So it's not all about validation in those particular instances. Oh, so the ego always portrays itself as the light, and the unconscious mind is always portrayed as the darkness. And the light is always trying to, destroy the darkness. You can't have one without the other, obviously. Mm-hmm. But it really says something about the ego that thinks it always must be in charge and thinks of itself as the light. Now, if the great hero deed is to get past that, but now you're faced with a problem. Let's say that you do see reality with a capital R. That's enough to drive a lot of people crazy. And John Horgan, in his book, Rational Mysticism, mentions this little parable of I think it's the four rabbis who finally managed to get past the ego, and they're experiencing reality with a capital R. Maybe they're seeing the face of God or something like this. And one of them dies outright. One of them goes insane. One becomes a heretic, and the other is completely blissful and happy as a consequence of this. The point here is that even if you're heroic enough to get past the ego and vanquish it, chances are it's not going to work for you. You're just going to lose your mind. It's a rare thing. So the hero, I think Campbell would even acknowledge this, it's got to be rare. But today, in our commercialized settings, like everybody's a hero. Everybody needs a pat on the back. Everyone is so successful and wonderful and morally superior, and they completely unwarranted sense of their own intellectual and moral superiority. But there you go. Yeah. But yeah, I do think Campbell would caution us about egomaniacal behavior. Absolutely.
Yeah, and probably about this constant repetition of this truncated version. Like I said, of the hero myth.
It's a Cliff's Notes version. It's easy to memorize. I do confess, I present this to my students in my classes, but we're dealing with 19, 20-year-old kids, and they need something to start them off with. But I always attempt to emphasize that abyss motif, a testing of characters as a consequence of dealing with some sort of dark force, seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Now, probably the tendency for a student, definitely the tendency for Hollywood movies is, the person who faces the obstacles in the darkness always overcomes the obstacle in the darkness, and then is celebrated in some way at the end. I did notice this in a lot of Hollywood filmmaking, that at the end, the hero must be surrounded by lots and lots of people who are applauding him for his great deeds. It's
and
cringy.
That's interesting. That's something people will have to read your book, because we can't tell the whole story of all the 3 stories in your book. But that was one of the things that struck me at the end. In your stories, often there is not this applauding sense or this I've conquered it all. There remains a whole bunch of ambiguity. People kind of reminiscing about what happened all those years ago, and, I didn't do perfectly, but I did something, and maybe that was good enough. There's not this heroic end to it. And that was one of the things I was really wondering about. Was that conscious on your part not to heroify your heroes?
I don't think it was conscious on my part. There we go with that unconscious part of ourselves. I always say that storytelling oftentimes is really more intuitive than it is intellectual. And this may sound odd, but the story kind of takes on a life of its own after a while. And the characters, too, must take on lives of their own, because I think a reader, and if you go to a movie and see this too in storytelling, you can easily detect when a character, or even the story itself, is simply a mouthpiece for the author or the filmmaker's intellect or ideology. I wasn't trying to push any kind of ideology or religious or political or anything else. It just sort of happened on its own intuitively. And hopefully it's correct in that sense, that it's coming from some other part that's not intellectual, some other part of my mind.
That brings us to the topic of idealism, actually, or of contemporary idealism, which is gaining traction again over against the materialist worldview, which has been dominant for quite some time now. And you see like people like Bernardo Kastrup, which I have had conversations with before on my podcast and so on. And I know that you've published your book in a publisher where Bernardo also publishes, and where he wants to where he often tries to publish more books about idealism, and it was an explicit effort to not for once bring analytical philosophy or let's say non-fiction about idealism, but to also publish a book which is a novel and which is literature with idealist themes ingrained within it. So you don't push a certain ideology, that's certainly true, but there was this idealist slant to it, or at least there's part of your intuition is an intuition about the world being not based in matter, but the ground of being consciousness in the end. And
Right.
so here's my question. I do notice the attraction, like I said, of idealism today. That's one. But two, it has been overshadowed, although idealism has a very long history, and there's lots to say for the idea that idealism has actually been dominant in, let's say, the Middle Ages and before, in Christian settings, in Asian settings, and so on. So idealism is not something that falls out of the sky right now. It has been there, but it has been pushed to the side because of a scientist and a materialist and a physicalist approach to reality. But so now that it's getting more traction again, I do believe that it does need different stories, because people like Bernardo, whom I certainly appreciate in all he does, but people like him tend to go on the, let's say, philosophical and analytic. His philosophy is also called analytical idealism. And so he has this very philosophical, scientific approach about the facts, and the facts he sees as kind of indicating that idealism is true, and anybody can watch the thousands of hours of YouTube material by now about it, which is a lot of interesting discussions on a philosophical, factual, and scientific level. But personally, I don't think that we're ever gonna convince a huge amount of people with facts and with discussion alone, and that we actually need stories and ways of telling things on a more intuitive level, like you've been explaining. That is what storytelling does. It brings the intuition to the fore in a different kind of manner. And so if that is the case, my question becomes, what kind of stories do we need to tell that bring in this new novel way of thinking about the reality of the world? Did you consciously bring in new, I don't know, elements of the way you tell your story? Or is it just about the things that your stories talk about? Or how do you try to translate your idealist intuitions in your stories?
Now, that is interesting. I will say that I wasn't specifically thinking about idealism per se. It's fascinating. I started writing my new book, Bridge of Dreams, a couple of years ago. And during the rewrite process, that's when I discovered Bernardo, and I think mainly through his talks. And then I picked up one of his books. I think it's called More Than Allegory. I know it's on my shelf. And that's where I encountered idealism. And I wasn't, it hadn't been formulated in my head so specifically, and then I wanted to put that on the page. I was just telling stories as I always just normally do. But when it comes to idealism, we need stories that maybe reference idealist concepts. But you're still faced with this problem. Most people are only going to respond to not the philosophical ideas per se, I don't think, but to character performing an action in a particular setting. And so the idealist philosophy has to be embodied in some way. It cannot be an abstraction. And most people are going to respond to a character who I think is in pursuit of a higher goal of some kind. So that kind of does meet the hero in a sense. I suppose you could argue that, let's say that you have a hero who's come to this realization that idealism is correct. Well, what obstacles would that person encounter? Well, I think we see it all around us in the modern world. It's scientism, which tells us that physical materialism is the only truth. It's the best, and it's the only truth. And it tends to denigrate thousands of years of religious tradition. I wonder if that's the obstacle that today we have to overcome as people in the society. I keep seeing this, as my experience as an educator. It's sort of sad is that people are becoming more and more addicted to their electronic devices. Just yesterday, as a matter of fact, I sat down with some of my colleagues at a university, and they're all bemoaning the fact that their students are so transfixed by their screens that they're not paying attention in class. And, the content that they're consuming on their phones and on their computers, it tends to be materialist pursuits. It's very shallow, no spirituality to it whatsoever. I wonder if this is the great adventure that that humanity is now going to face. It's like, how do you overcome a purely materialistic point of view? I try to capture some of that in my book, Bridge of Dreams, where really the story is about one protagonist over the course of several lifetimes. The story takes place over a 200-year span, and the main character while living three different lives really almost feels like three different people, because that person is experiencing different things in those three different lifetimes, and you must respond to that. But the concept, I think Bernardo would probably define idealism this way, is that it's consciousness that's primary and not materialism, that consciousness somehow, or mind at large, if you want to describe it that way, is the eternal thing. It supersedes physicalism. I like this analogy that maybe consciousness, mind at large, is like a vast ocean, and each one of us as an individual is merely a ripple on that ocean. And once we die, our little egos sink back into that vast ocean. The ocean doesn't go away. Maybe it manifests some more ripples a little bit later. So in that sense, maybe we never die. We're always conscious, always. It's just that you don't have any memory of your previous forms of ego. It's like, I believe Bernardo described this in one of his talks. Imagine right now, right this instant, if your entire memory was erased and you had no idea who you were or what your nationality was or what your language is. You'd still be a conscious being. You would still have experience. You would still have something that's qualitative rather than quantitative. Sight, sound, taste, smell, touch. You'd still be experiencing things. But that whole ego that you had is just gone. It's vanished. I'm wondering, maybe we start over and over and over again like that. We sink back into this the void, maybe you'd like to call it that, and then we emerge out of the void again and again and again. It's one of the ideas I was playing with in Bridge of Dreams. Mm-hmm. That one form of consciousness disappears only to emerge later. But the ego has vanished, But you as a person with experience is still always there. You're always a being of some kind.
Doesn't that mean that if the ground of existence is consciousness, and we are ripples on the lake of consciousness, on the cosmic lake of consciousness, then in a sense, we all are simply stories within the great consciousness, being taught up within that consciousness?
So I love this idea. Boy, you can go down a rabbit hole here for sure, but it's in Hinduism, right, where Vishnu is dreaming the universe. Mm-hmm. But now remember, dreams are beyond conscious control. In some sense, dreams are unconscious. Yeah. And so consciousness, like, maybe it's not consciousness at all. Maybe it's unconscious that's controlling everything. Yeah. It's the dream-like thing that even God is dreaming, and mm-hmm. God can't control the dream necessarily. I like Alan Watts' analogy here, where he says consciousness really, and the limited ego, it's more like a flashlight, and you're in this vast darkness. And your ego consciousness is just a little flashlight that's giving you a little bit of information here and there. And usually we use consciousness as a way to maneuver through complex social relationships. But mainly everything that's happening to us is unconscious. Maybe the Vedantic philosophers would use the word Atman, mm-hmm. but I like to bring this up with my students, and Alan Watts uses this as well. He says, how do you digest your food? How are you doing that? If you cut yourself and then the skin repairs, how are you doing that? How are you beating your heart? How are you breathing? How are you thinking your thoughts? How are you doing? When you're looking and seeing something, are you controlling all the rods and cones in your eyeball? All right, well, there's a part of us that knows perfectly well how we're doing that. The unconscious mind, maybe, or you could call it this. It knows exactly how it's doing this, but the ego, the conscious part of ourselves, mm-hmm. demands to know how it's being done. We want the information. How is this mm-hmm. happening? And the unconscious theoretically could explain it all, but it would take thousands upon thousands of years to do this, and because The conscious ego is very inefficient. It has to scan line after line of text. You'd have to read tons and tons of medical books just to understand how the heart beats, and you'd go to medical school and spend years and years. And even then, you don't exactly know how in the world this is happening. It's a mystery. Most everything is unconscious. But, the unconscious might be too much of an abstraction. It needs more like form. And that's what story is. It's giving a form to spirit.
Which brings us right back to Rupert Sheldrake, who always says that you've got the unconscious consciousness of the divine, and then the form, the word that is being spoken, the word, or let's say the story, the form that it takes, and then the flow of breath, as he says, in between them, which is the Holy Spirit. And so he comes to a triune or a Trinitarian concept of reality, more than a monistic. In a way, it's monistic. In a way, it's Trinitarian. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, but sooner or later, you do need form. I think, by definition, that's what a story is, and so you need that embodiment.
I find that always interesting that today people, when they get to more idealist convictions, there's a tendency to go completely in the Advaitic, or how you pronounce that in English, the monist accounts and non-dualist accounts of idealism. But it's interesting to see, and then they mostly wind up in Indian philosophy, and then people start thinking that Indian philosophy always has been this Advaitic, non-dualist philosophy, which isn't the case. You've got dualist Hinduist philosophies as well, and you've also got what they call qualified non-dualism. And the qualified non-dualism, for example, Kashmiri Shaivism would be one example of it. It has form ingrained, and the expression of the divine in form is just as divine as the non-expressed form of the divine. And I personally find that also more attractive, but of course, I'm born and raised in a Christian context, but I find it more attractive than the typical non-dualist stance where all of reality becomes, reality that we see around us, becomes nothing but illusion. The ground of being is consciousness, and that's it. And everything else, well, that's something that you imagine there to be, but the real reality is behind that stuff. And one part of me says, yes, that's true. But the other part of me says, no, there's a reason why it got expressed. The form is the way of experiencing that divine, and it matters in itself. Matter matters. It's not the ground of being, but it's there for a reason. And one of the reasons for me is beauty. If you want to express beauty, well, you'll have to create a flower or something. If you want to explain or express beauty in time, then you'll need stories, beautiful stories. If it's just going to be this monistic whole all the time, that's a pretty boring thing in the end. But if you want beauty and excitement and what they call in Hindu terms ananda, if you want the blissfulness, really, you'll have to have this expressed formative principle as well. And in that respect, I'm all with Rupert Sheldrake on this one.
I love this concept too. This also comes from Alan Watts, who said, now imagine you are God, and that's almost like the basis for a lot of grim fairy tales. But you're God, and so you're omniscient and omnipresent, you're all-powerful and all-seeing, and you could have any wish you want come true. Wouldn't it get boring after a while? And wouldn't you want to have a little bit of an adventure? I heard this psychologist was talking about, he had a client, and the man was very depressed, the client, and the psychologist said, well, what is it that you'd like in life to make you happy? And the guy said, well, I'd like to sit on a beach all day and drink margaritas. And the psychologist said, well, how many darn margaritas can you drink? 100, 1,000? How many days are you going to sit on that beach for, 50 years? At some point, when you get bored of all of this, Well, let's say that you're God, and so you can have anything you want, anytime you want. Every blissful wish and thought can come true. At some point, you'd want a little bit of an adventure. You'd want something exciting to happen. You'd want some danger, but you'd be okay because you know you're God, and the little dream that you're having can come to an end at some point, and you can be restored back to your godlike powers. But what if God just keeps going further and further and further out into this adventure where God completely forgets himself, that is no longer, and basically that's what we all are, that we're all these little characters in God's dream. But don't worry, we'll all come back to this unity at some point. But we're just an expression of the dream or the imagination, or a story, basically, in the mind of God.
The lila, as they sometimes call it in Hinduism, the play of the divine, and the dance of the divine.
And maybe for no other reason than it's pleasurable, the story.
Yeah.
Although, how do you account for so many nightmarish things in this world, too? That's theodicy. That's a big problem.
It remains a huge problem, but not necessarily the topic of today, perhaps for another day. And so let me get back to something that I didn't delve into, but you said something about your students being glued to their screens and being way too immersed in the material life. And I guess you sometimes, certainly if you want to make good writers out of them, if you want to make some of them good storytellers, you want to get them out of this gluedness and this disastrous way that big business and tech industry has captured our attention and focus. And so it's a bit of a segue too. At different points in your book, there's reference to psychedelic experiences. And so do you think psychedelic experiences are necessary in this materialist world to get people back to realizing that perhaps in life there's more than the material world, and there's a world of consciousness, spirit, whatever it is, beyond matter? Do you feel that it's also quite popular these days in certain spiritual circles, the whole hallucinatory and psychedelic experience? And so, where do you stand? Do you think it's necessary to find new stories? Are we too ingrained in the story of big business and making as much money as you want in life, or as you can in life, and so on, that we've come to a place where we need to be pulled out of it?
It's possible. The thing with psychedelics is you can get a couple of different types of experiences. Some people are going to have a positive one, and some people are going to have an absolutely terrifying, hellish experience. That ego dissolution, I think, is something that does that to people, where it's bad. And you've got to find your correct combination for you personally. I say, unlike Aldous Huxley or a famous writer in America, Hunter S. Thompson, I've never tried the most serious of the psychedelic stuff. Maybe I should, practice what I preach. In America, we have legalized THC products in most states, but even that's becoming commodified, and you're getting stronger and stronger doses, and people are abusing it and using it simply recreationally. Maybe they shouldn't. In my book, Bridge of Dreams, I reference something that Rupert Sheldrake talked about. There's in one of his books on spiritual practices in England, there's a group of people. It's called Cathedrals on Cannabis, and you take a heroic dose of THC, and then you go to the cathedral, and it's a much more immersive experience, and it gets people in touch with the holy. For some people, that's probably very true, but of course, for some people, you might descend into Dante's Inferno and see all kinds of terrible things that you don't want to see. So what's good for you personally? Now, what has worked for me, I like THC products. I've used them for a while, and I don't do big dosages. I confess I'm a little bit of a weakling, and just like 5 milligrams or something, 10 at the most. Otherwise, I start to get paranoid. But what I do is I combine it with physical activity. Now, Sheldrake mentions this too, that when you're having a religious experience, it's not simply a matter of, say, going to the cathedral. It's making a pilgrimage to the cathedral so that there's some physical activity involved. He actually recommends, rather than walking directly into the cathedral, circle the cathedral several times, in deep meditation. You're walking around this gorgeous structure and before entering, right? So you're kind of making a little bit of a pilgrimage there. For me, I'm very, very fortunate in Cleveland, Ohio, which is a fairly large city. There is a national park nearby, and so few cities. Every city has a park or several parks, but a national park is more like a wilderness area. So I'll take my little gummy that I bought from the store, and then I'll go out into the wilderness, and I try to find remote trails, and it's just incredible how it works for me, where suddenly everything that I see in nature just looks so extraordinary. It just looks so beautiful and meaningful. And I'm combining this sometimes with rigorous exercise where I might hike 5, 6, 7 miles. And at the end of that rigorous exercise, I just feel a kind of sense of elation. Suddenly my mind is clear. Joseph Campbell talks about this. He says, you always need one place in your life where you can get away from, what do I owe people? What do people owe me? I've got a grudge against this person. You've got to be able to have like a room in your house where you can shut yourself away from all of that kind of thing and make it your own little sacred space. For me, it's going to this national park, and you're just out there in nature, and suddenly everything looks a lot more positive than it would otherwise. Now, for my students who are staring at screens constantly, I keep telling them, guys, climb a mountain once. I went to the Great Smoky National Park. I think this was in the Tennessee area. But I climbed a mountain. It was 7,000 feet. Again, I had my little gummy, and it's strenuous exercise climbing up to this altitude of 7,000 feet. But then the view out there is absolutely stunning. I remember Rupert Sheldrake saying, the curious thing about beauty on a scale like that is that in some way, it is terrifying. And he noted that people, when looking out at a gorgeous vista like this, they suddenly get very, very nervous, and they begin taking pictures right away and looking at their phones and seeing how the picture turned out. They're not looking at the view, they're looking at their photograph of the view. And then they start talking with one another, trying to fill that void of silence or solitude. And boy, would you look at this. I've seen something like that in my past vacations. And there's something about looking at that vista. It's the more than human world, and it just fills you with a kind of sense of awe, wonder, and beauty, but also dread. It's like, wow, would you just look at that? Look at the power and the majesty of that. I'm like a little grain of sand in comparison to all of this. Mm-hmm. But it's all experiential. It's the quality of the experience. All right, now my students staring at their screens all the time, I say, guys, you've got to get out and have experiences. Stop looking at your screens, go out there, see the world. You want to put yourself in a place where maybe you do feel a little bit scared, and that you're going beyond your the limits of your abilities. And maybe there's a little bit of danger involved in that, but I don't think you're going to regret this. This is not to say that we should discount altogether business and finance and all of that. I think in my response to you, I mentioned a film from 1976 called Network. Mm-hmm. It's about a television news broadcaster who suddenly has a nervous breakdown. You can interpret that way, or a sudden mystical experience where he hears a voice in his head. Well, the first thing the producers want to do is commodify that experience, and they put him on TV not as a journalist, but as a madman of the airwaves. And they're just trying to sell advertisement. But throughout that movie, if you watch it, the screenwriter Patty Chayefsky gives commerce and money a religious dimension. It's just dripping with religious imagery. And in fact, the news broadcaster who is put back on TV repeatedly, despite the fact that he's maybe not doing so well psychologically, they surround him in stained glass windows. It's like, why would they do that? And then at some point, the CEO of the company drags this poor man into the big boardroom. The CEO describes it as Valhalla and then says, life is a business. It's the ebb and flow of money. In this particular instance, you tried to stop a business transaction, but money has been taken out of our country and money must be put back into the country. It's like the yin and the yang, the ebb and flow of existence. You just see this constantly in that film. I think Chayefsky's point is we shouldn't denigrate money and commerce and business right away. We should look a little bit deeper into it. It might have some religious dimensions to it. Mm-hmm. For me, it's depressing. You know, I can't imagine working in an office every single day and, you know, a boardroom. I'd much prefer to be out in nature. But it's just, we shouldn't make a straw man out of it. It's very powerful. I mean, we can see this in the classroom where the kids are addicted to their screens. There's something about commerce that is so powerful that people are attracted to it, just like the metal shavings are attracted to that magnet. What is it that's so... Is it just the money? Can money represent something else?
The attraction to the story of what it'll bring.
Yes.
There's this drive behind it. Yeah, definitely. But so in the psychedelic experiences, I can imagine what you explain about how you go to nature and have walks and while having a cannabis trip and how it inspires you and makes you see the world in its brightness. I definitely have my own experiences both with psychedelics and THC. So I understand what you're coming from. And personally, I think that in ritualized settings, which is kind of what you described, that there's certain points where you use it in a certain ritual way, I definitely understand. But I also have my fear and my doubts whether the experience itself is not becoming the thing which is being sold. And so then people get stuck within that experience, and even more so, then it becomes something that allows you to, well, the typical age-old escape from reality, a flight from reality, so that you don't have to deal with the stuff that's happening in the world right now. And people start using psychedelics perhaps a bit as a form of escapism. Not start to, they've done that all through history, I guess. So that's not what I think is special about it, but I think there's something about the story that is being told again. And again, it relates to the myth of the hero as well, that, oh, take this heroic dose, we call it a heroic dose as well, take this heroic dose and your life will be completely changed, and then you'll have seen the truth. But along with this, having seen the truth, comes a kind of neglect also of what is politically happening in the world, because all of a sudden you've become so spiritual. So there's this weird story, which is obviously easily commodifiable by business and by publishing houses and so on, where the psychedelics becomes a psychedelic spirituality industry or something like that. And it's driven by a heroic story of how psychedelics will change your mind. So that's one of my kind of nuances, at least, I'd say.
Yeah, there is a definite danger in that, isn't there? Maybe that's human nature too, that there's just a big propensity for people to abuse the substance. I was reading beer possibly might date back to 30,000 BC. I mean, that seems pretty incredible, but just fermented beverages of some kind that are going to give us that kind of an effect. I mean, that's a long time for a substance to have its hooks in us. But the curious thing that I was reading about, it's just a hypothesis, is that people developed agriculture and civilization not because they wanted some sort of protection, building walls against adversaries, or they wanted a constant supply of food and nutrition, but they wanted to get drunk all the time. And that's why why agriculture started. Let's find a way so we could get drunk constantly. I don't know, maybe it's just a hypothesis, but
it's an interesting hypothesis at least. Yeah.
There is a propensity for people to abuse this stuff. How do you stop people from doing that? But I take your point. I think that's very interesting. It's become a kind of industry, cottage industry.
And above all, not just a cottage industry, but this weird link with spiritual heroism. And again, it's pretending you're gonna get through your ego, all the while not really. It's just your ego searching for yet another experience. And if you don't get it from bungee jumping, you'll get it from being spiritual because you took a heroic dose of LSD or ayahuasca or something like that. Obviously, I don't have any problems with ayahuasca ceremonies and so on. I've done them myself. There can be lots of beauty in it, but there's this strange way in which the ego often is capable of pretending that it has conquered itself.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm interested in that. So you've done the ayahuasca ceremonies before?
Oh yeah. Obviously, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm into religion. You have to research everything experientially to really get to know it. So,
was it a positive experience for you, or experiences?
For me personally, it's a positive experience, but I'd add a but. I'm pretty metacognitive when it comes to drug experiences, so I'm constantly aware of the fact that it's a drug experience. Yes. Even though I'm the first to say, I really understand why people have the feeling that ayahuasca brings them to the spirit world, because yes, that's what it does. It kind of, once it hits, it gives you this flip feeling of stepping through a layer of reality into another layer where you get the psychedelic experience. And in a sense, I guess I don't have any acquaintance with LSD, but what I read about it, certain psychedelics like LSD have a tendency to give you those forms and shapes and patterns and become a bit more mathematical in a sense. But for me, ayahuasca and for many people is lots more storified. It's seeing figures and characters and how they interact with you and so on. But so as a psychedelic experience, I thought it was really interesting. I can certainly understand that certain people open a door within themselves and as such find it very useful to do it. On the other hand, I'd say there was, like most drugs, there's mostly they're amplifying. I do not think that they often bring that really completely novel new things that weren't there somewhere within yourself to start with, either consciously or a little bit subconsciously, but not even that deep subconsciously. So I tend to have the feeling that they amplify whatever was already brewing within the soul. But that in itself can, of course, be very useful. The amplification itself can be exactly what you need. But, and that's the second but, and that's the most important one, I guess that was my first experience of ayahuasca. And that relates to the nuance that I just explained, was afterwards, so the group did the whole ceremony, and then everybody slept on the floor and so on, because afterwards it takes a couple of hours and you do it during the night, and then people mostly rested out. And then in the morning we got together, and then there was somebody who was gonna lead the newbies, let's say, in a group discussion of what was it like and how did it feel. And there was this one guy there who had done a lot of those ayahuasca ceremonies and was getting ready to go to the Amazon and so on. So he was really into it. And he starts the group discussion by saying, I'm so happy for all of you that you finally discovered the plant, and the plant will teach you everything. And now you're into a new life and you can see what the plant brings to you and how it spiritually elevates you, and so on and so on. And I was listening to the guy, I was thinking, replace ayahuasca and the plant with Jesus. What does he sound like? Oh, I'm so happy you finally discovered Jesus, and Jesus will finally elevate you and you'll be saved. I mean, if it was any evangelical, he'd think that evangelical was a dogmatic, problematic, missionizing Christian. But because it's ayahuasca, it's fine. And that's where, it, like I say, the ego tends to tell itself it conquered itself, or people tell themselves that they're non-religious, all the while portraying every aspect of a normal classical religious context. And so it's more the context and the surroundings in which this psychedelic spirituality thrives that I would critique, not the plant itself, obviously not, it's age-old. And one of the aspects that for me is quite telling in this respect is that if you look at most traditions, it's not always the case, but most shamanic traditions where they use psychedelics, often it will be the shaman who takes them, but not the people surrounding them. So it's the shaman who goes on a trip and he goes to the underworld, let's say the subconscious, and from the underworld or the subconscious, he brings a gift. Either you have to take this medicine and then you'll be cured, or the thing that you've lost, you can find it over there. Whatever that the gift was that the shaman came back with, it was the shaman doing it and the shaman taking it. And nowadays, it has become, let's all go on a trip together. And in a certain sense, that tells you something about how we reappropriated, yes, an old concept, but in ways that at least you can wonder how much they're influenced by the current state of individualism and consumptive or the consumer society.
You know, it's so funny, and I remember just reading about this, that typically it is an individual, but it has now suddenly become communal, but an individual taking the substance and then using it for communal decision-making. But now if everybody's taking it, it might dilute it a little bit, but the communal decision-making that's being made is, like you said, it almost sounds like a proselytizing evangelical who immediately wants to make it a kind of dogmatism or ideology.
Yeah.
It's really remarkable.
No, and it's not like I have any problem with dogmatism and proselytization. Again, something that you see in all religious traditions. But it's the fact that you claim that you're something different. That bothers me most of all.
I haven't taken part in any kind of communal drug taking like this. Maybe I should, just to, have that experience. And I probably would experience much the same things you are. I was struck by one thing that you said earlier, as you were formulating that concept, is you find yourself more having a metacognition experience, that it's less a direct experience than you thinking about the experience. I find that as I get older, that's been happening to me more and more. When you're young, of course, the experience is just sort of flowing through you. But now there's a lot of metacognition, a lot of self-analysis. And part of it is trying to escape from that, too, which I'm finding as I get older a little bit more difficult to achieve.
Yeah, I understand. One last thing that I wanted to talk to you about is talking about idealism and also psychedelics and so on. again, this is kind of a critique or something that I'm thinking about, and I'd like to exchange some thoughts. Also, because I've been asking this question to more people, one of them being Bernardo, which we talked about, and the other being Jeffrey Kripal, also interesting author. And both of them, I told them, yes, idealism is becoming more popular and things like psychedelic use. But shouldn't we watch out that it also becomes this new story that really is linked with something that we don't necessarily support? And let's say my point is mostly this, that if you look at what materialism is in a philosophical sense, or in a social sense, I should say, in a social sense, it's a philosophy that supports capitalism. Because if matter is all there is, then obviously it becomes normal that the way to go forward in life is to amass as much matter as you can. That is what capitalism is. And so there's good reasons why capitalism and a materialist worldview went hand in hand the last 300 years. And so my wonder is whether the new revival of idealism could perhaps also go in a problematic direction, because if you look at certain people in Silicon Valley, they have a tendency to also tell a lot of stories about their psychedelic experience and about how they have become fans of certain forms of idealist worldviews, which are often also linked with new technological evolutions, and then you get to AI and so on. Because all in all, if you look at the way that people present AI as this computers will become conscious one day, which I don't believe, but that's a whole other topic. So the idea that computers will become conscious immediately implies that our brains are nothing but a computer, and so that one day we will be able to upload our mind into a computer. In a sense, that's an idealist concept. We are nothing but mind, and the body doesn't matter too much. And so if you extract the mind or the consciousness from the robot being the body, you can place it in another robot. Wouldn't that be a great idea? Now, I think it's unfeasible, but trying to get to that point, it's also a very big story. It's a huge story of why we could and should develop that kind of technology, while it's fraught with thousands of problems, not least ethical and juridical and so on. But it's driven by this, in a sense, spiritual story about what mind is, and in a certain way, it's driven by a new form of idealism. I personally think a problematic idealism, but so how do we counter the narrative or the story of that type of idealism? Or are we, as you in a sense as a story maker and me as a researcher of religion, who also likes thinking about idealism and spirituality, are we kind of drawn in a new ideological story creation of a certain elite, let's say?
This led me down a path too, just with specific stories, but people in Silicon Valley who have become captured a little bit by the idea of idealism. But then the point they want to make, right, is that can mind be disembodied in some sense? That's where they're running into the big stumbling block, as far as I can tell. Yeah. The specific example that I think this guy is the Beethoven of filmmakers, but I don't know if you're a fan of Stanley Kubrick at all. Definitely. And in the late 1960s, he made this film 2001: A Space Odyssey. The opening sequence there establishes a very important theme, I think, that is definitely worth contemplating, especially if we're thinking about a disembodied mind. It begins with the famous Dawn of Man sequence, And Kubrick begins with these establishing shots of a vast arid landscape. He's almost paralleling this landscape with outer space, if you continue watching the film, but it's just total desolation out there. And then we see our primate ancestors, Australopithecus afarensis on the African plain there. And they're completely at the mercy of the environment and other creatures out there. I just read recently that human beings, we always think of them as man the hunter, when in fact it was probably more likely man the hunted. And a lot of fossils show signs of having been torn apart by big cats. And so this is a great intuitive insight on the part of Kubrick. One of the early shots, we see our primate ancestors. First thing that happens is a big cat comes down and kills one of the poor primates. All right, a scene or two later, they encounter the famous monolith, if you can remember that. And this seems to spark a little bit of consciousness in these poor creatures. First thing they do after receiving this spark is they get a found object, in this case a bone, and they use the bone to kill prey in order to obtain food. They later then use the bone to kill their enemies who are trying to take over their limited resources, like a watering hole. But if you watch 2001 very, very carefully, what you're going to see again and again are images of food. The creature throws the bone up in the air. You might remember this famous shot. It comes down as a spaceship. It's a quick cut to let us know that time has passed. The tool has evolved. But if you watch the film, you're still going to see these men in spaceships, and they're always eating food. All the way up until the final sequence where the main character, David Bowman, I think his name is in this sort of alien purgatory all alone, and he's sitting at a table and he's enjoying a meal by himself. He's eating food. All right, one thing I think Kubrick is trying to show us here is that HAL 9000, the computer in 2001, later goes on a terrifying, murderous rampage and kills off some astronauts. Kubrick, I think, is saying that if you have a disembodied mind, the problem is you're skipping past millions and millions and millions of years of evolution, this slow, gradual process where human beings, because they had the experience of cold, the experience of hunger, the experience of thirst, they learned to develop these tools, and the tools also help then develop consciousness and civilization. Well, the computer has never experienced cold or heat or pain or hunger. It doesn't know what the taste of chocolate is like. It doesn't know what it's like to fall in love or to have its heart broken. And simply by giving it an algorithm or tons and tons of data to process in order to become so-called conscious, is this going to work necessarily? I mean, can we have a machine that is purely conscious and not unconscious? Can we uncouple consciousness from the unconscious? Can we have something that's purely ego? And if we do have something that is purely ego, wouldn't that be a nightmare in some sense? I think that's why a lot of sci-fi films about AI are nightmare scenarios. The other one that I can think of is Alex Garland's much more recent film. It's called Ex Machina, highly recommended, where a poor college student is invited by a Silicon Valley titan, more or less, to do the Turing test on a computer. Well, the computer, obviously, it looks like a very attractive female, and this poor college guy is attracted to her, and she begins to manipulate him. And sooner or later, the monster escapes from the lab, so to speak. Frankenstein's monster is out into the world, kills her creator, and I think the filmmaker is implying that robots like this would just kill off humanity in general. We're just kind of a nuisance and a hindrance to their overall aims. Would a purely ego-centered, disembodied consciousness look like? Who knows? I don't think it's a matter of whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing, I think we are doing it. I don't think there's anything that's going to stop this train. We're pursuing this. We want a disembodied mind. That disembodied mind might be Hell 9000. You know, it's like, careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
It could be quite nightmarish. I don't even know if that is such a thing as possible. Like I said, can you uncouple consciousness from the unconscious, which, you know, needs time and evolution?
Yeah, it's interesting. Brings us back to one of those aspects that we already talked about, this need for the body, for form as an integral aspect of being and not just disembodied mind as such. And I think that that's exactly why I sometimes question the revival of idealism. Will it become an idealism that is purely about consciousness and nothing else? What then do we do with the body, and why is the body there? Does it have value in itself? And if so, which value, and so on? Because if we don't think about this thoroughly, then I do think that things like hell are things that will be built, and not because they will be necessarily conscious, but because you can easily create murderous algorithms. I mean, they're all around us nowadays as well. There's drones flying around in different parts of the world who are just algorithmically killing people. So it goes to show how far we can go with those algorithms. But if you again storify the algorithm, if you give it this idea of it seems like a human, and then you get into the Turing test kind of realm, then people truly start thinking that it's a conscious being. And for me, that's really a theological question, this whole AI thing. There's lots to say about the ethical aspect and the juridical aspect and so on, and I'm all on board for that one, but it's above all a theological question, because it's about, is our mind simply that? Are we simply algorithms or not? And if the basis of our soul is indeed spirit, yes. But how exactly does it relate to our body? I think these are some of the grand questions that have always been discussed, but which are really at the forefront of today's technology.
Yeah, the horrifying thing about it, I suppose, is we want a conscious machine, but we don't know what consciousness even is. Mm-hmm. So how can we possibly do something like this? It's a brave new world for sure. I always said I'd like to come back in 100 years just to see what everything is like, or would I? I don't know. Or maybe I will. Who knows? Maybe they'll.
Who knows? Well then, on that note, I think 100 years we probably don't have to wait, but perhaps in a year or two we can revisit what we discussed today and so on. Until then, I'd propose that anybody who has been listening to the podcast go and gets your book and just takes the time, perhaps some HTC as well, and then reads the book and gets into that dreamy state that I talked about in the beginning of the show. Well, Kevin, this was an absolute delight for me to talk to you about all these topics, which are dear to my heart.
Thank you so much for asking the questions, because it really made me think about them much more deeply than I otherwise would have. So I appreciate the interview, Jonas. It was a lot of fun.